I think most people get smart meters because they're effectively bullied into it. I keep getting these letters telling me it's urgent that I have to get a smart meter. I've had a knock at the door telling me I've got to get a smart meter. I am not getting a smart meter. And why? Because when you're... and they'll tell you you'll save money and all the rest of it. Of course, you won't. Why? Because they're using it because they want... And they admit it. The water companies admitted openly to manage demand, which means when it suits, they can turn you off. When the windmills and the solar farms don't produce enough electricity, they can turn you off. The same with water and the same indeed with gas. Well, Chris O'Shea, who's the boss of British Gas, who, as I mentioned before the break, earned 8.2 million quid last year, has said smart meters should be mandatory in every household in order to, have you guessed it, meet net zero targets. There you are. There you are. You have to be hooked up to a smart meter to meet net zero. He's alarmed that 44% of his customers don't have them. And that may well be, Chris O'Shea, because they don't actually want them, because they don't trust you or any of the other companies. Harry, when you get these letters or these phone calls, the impression the companies give you is that legally they have the right to do this, but they don't, do they?
That's right. And I have experience of this as well. I was just recently pressured relentlessly on the telephone to get a smart meter. What we see is that compulsion is the name of the game when it comes to net zero. And this is the latest example of that. We're being asked as consumers to facilitate the needs of the companies, of the government. It used to be that these companies competed to meet our needs and we had choices as consumers. Now it seems to have flipped around with the business class, the political class, telling people you have to behave in this way, you have to get the smart meter, you have to drive an electric car, you have to get a heat pump, and they don't seem to accept it.
Now, at the moment, and we have made this point to our viewers and listeners before, however much they give the impression that they have the right to do this, legally, you can stand your ground.
Well, you can. I would have certainly urged people to think about their personal circumstances. Now, when you look at the economics of this, you will find, that there can be savings from, matching demand and supply. However, it's reliant on people using energy maybe at different times. The people who will be suffering from this will be the 9-to-5ers, people going into jobs, they have to go into the office, whereas maybe people who have the luxury of working from home and detached homes, who tend to be fairly wealthier, will be able to choose to use energy when they need it. And, a Public Accounts Committee report just last year found that, the benefits of the smart meter programme went overwhelmingly to the richest. And that's no surprise. We see that across many green policies.
Yeah, and the worst off, of course, of all are those on prepay meters. And they're the ones, I think, paying the highest prices for everything, aren't they?
That's right. Energy costs go, are felt most pronounced by the poorest people in our society. Getting energy bills down is a moral imperative for the government. They've spent the last 20 years focusing on decarbonisation to the exclusion of affordability, reliability, national security.
Yeah, more broadly, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, deniers, some of the worst people in the country. There does seem to be here, and particularly across Europe, quite a big change going on. The farmers' protests were perhaps one example of saying, look, this green policy is all going a little bit too far. EVs perhaps being a case in point. Very interesting, I thought, overnight, that Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and, he is one of our top 2 leading industrialists. So originally Boris said, after 2030, we will only be able to buy EVs, new EVs, no more petrol and diesel cars. And he was going to save the planet. It was all wonderful stuff. And then, of course, they said, well, it's not actually going to work, so we're going to shift that to 2035. Now Jim Ratcliffe is saying 2035 is completely unrealistic because people have stopped buying EVs in the same numbers.
Well, what we had was the ZEV mandate, which set a target. So we only saw a very modest change. It was only in the period between 2030 and 2035 that, just 20% of people can buy petrol cars at that time. So it's a small number. The leeway isn't very much. And so rather than only be allowed to buy plug-in hybrids during that 2030 to 35 period, people were able to buy now petrol cars as well. So there's been a modest slide back. The government needs to go further. You know, we've heard Claire Coutinho just recently speak about how net zero can't be about compulsion. It has to be about consumer choice.
The mood music from government is changing. Last thought, heat pumps. There are some people who think they're marvellous. Others say they cost an absolute fortune when it gets below 4 or 5 degrees. What's happening with the uptake of heat pumps?
Well, you know, when it comes to heat pumps, I'm not pro or anti-heat pump. What I think is people should be able to choose. And it's going to depend on what people's own house is like, whether it will work well for them.
Yeah.
I urge people
so a modern house, it might work.
But certainly, a modern houses, it might work.
Yeah.
Certainly, the rollout's going much slower than the government's hoped. It hoped to introduce a clean heats market mechanism to enforce the uptake of heat pumps, and it wanted to introduce that in April this year. It's pushed that back after a backlash.
Everything's being pushed back. Harry, thank you for joining me.